So sculpting in Blender, I'm not gonna lie, I find sculpting in Blender to be actually quite enjoyable. Even though it's obviously missing a lot of features that ZBrush has, I actually find myself to be very comfortable within Blender when it comes to sculpting. I'll share what are the settings that I like to use over my sculpting brushes in Blender. Give me a crooked tool and I'll build you a crooked house, they say. So we really have to start by making sure that the brushes that we're going to use have been configured properly. So I'm going to share what my settings are there. Now, of course, these are very personal settings. You may like to use different brushes in different ways, and you may want to tweak the settings on your own brushes completely differently than mine. And that's totally cool, but I'll show you what works for me and what helped me to sculpt that Emily Blunt portrait. I'm a huge fan of the clay brushes in general. Almost all sculpting softwares have their own implementation of some of the clay brushes or clay-like functionalities, and Blender is no exception. So really the first thing I did when I started to sculpt within Blender, the first question I have even asked myself was, okay, so where's the clay brush? And that's how I came across this clay strips brush that is right here. And it's a wonderful brush to use. I use it all the time if you look at my sculpting demos within Blender. But the thing that really struck me about the clay strips brush, though, the first time that I have used it, was the fact that it was actually very uneven. And you can see as I put a few brush strokes down on the surface here, you can see how it's very lumpy, it's very rough. We're just not getting a smooth stroke at all with the default settings that is on the brush there. So I've actually spent a whole night at some point just customizing the clay strips, trying to get the clay strips to be and to feel as good as I could. I've literally spent hours doing that, and I really like where I've winded up with that in the end. So there are a few things about a clay brush in general that is very important to me. The first is to have a stroke that is nice and smooth, so not to have that kind of lumpy, very rough, very artifacty kind of stroke like we have right now. If we zoom in there, you can really see what are all the individual samples. And the second thing that's very important to me when using a clay brush is to have the feeling that I have a wide range of elevation to the clay brush. Really feel as if there's a wide range to the intensity of the clay brush, so that I can go in here and I can create some very soft strokes, and I can also create very, very strong strokes that really displace the surface quite a lot. And I want to be able to do that without having to put so much pressure on the tablet or so little pressure on the tablet that I am losing control over my stroke. If you're just pressing really, really hard over the surface, then it actually becomes quite hard to control your brush. So it's very important for me that I am able to get a wide range of intensity on my clay brush while keeping the pressure that I put on the tablet within what I consider to be a normal range for me. So I'm kind of getting the soft strokes here. They're not too bad, but there's really not that much of a difference. See, as I'm putting a lot of pressure on the tablet, you can see there isn't that much difference in terms of displacement. So those are really two problems that we want to fix through tweaking the settings on our clay strips brush. By the way, one thing I actually like to do as well is to turn off the pressure influence on the size of the brush. I actually like to keep the size of my clay brush to be very consistent, because if I want a bigger brush, I'm just going to make my brush bigger. And if I want to have a smaller brush, I'm just going to make the brush size smaller, of course. And I really only want the pressure that I put on the tablet to have an influence over the intensity of the stroke, but not necessarily on the size of it. And then to control the lumpiness here, there's a few settings that we can play with to really get a very nice, smooth stroke. The first one that I found that had a major influence on the lumpiness of the stroke was the normal radius that is here. You could consider this to be how big is the area under your brush that is sampled every time that you put down a particular sample to judge, okay, what is the amount of displacement that the brush needs to put on the surface within Blender. So this normal radius being at the default value of 1.55, I find it really problematic, and I get a much smoother stroke. If I bring this value down, and I like here to keep it at around 0.9, I found that actually that worked really well for me. And you can already see the difference, right? You can already see how nice and clean my brush strokes have become just by varying this particular normal radius value that is right there. So our brush is a lot less lumpy, but we're still getting a lot of those little artifacts that you can see there. So to control that, we'll just go to stroke, and in here, we'll do a few things in here. The first thing we want to do in here is to simply increase the amount of samples on the brush so that every time that we do a stroke, there is more data that Blender collects to know where that and how that sample should be placed over the surface. So increasing the number of samples here will simply help us to have a smoother stroke. Now, if you increase this too high, let's say that I put this to the maximum of like 64, you'll see the kind of effect that we're going to get. We're going to get this extremely consistent stroke, but you can actually see that now I'm actually experiencing quite a lot of slowdowns here. But I found that keeping this around a value of 8 or so gave me very, very good performance, but also was helping to clean out a lot of that lumpiness within my brush strokes. And you can see the result of actually doing that. If I zoom in on the stroke now, you can see that even though our stroke is a lot cleaner than it was, we still have a little bit of that kind of accordion feeling over the surface there or so. And the reason for that is simply because there's just too much space between all of the samples of the brush. And so we can control that with the spacing value that is right here. It's set to 5% by default. Let's just take that and let's just lower that here to 2%. And having that here at 2% will effectively reduce the distance between all of the samples of our brush. And look at that. We're getting this very nice, smooth, very buttery stroke. If we find that in general that our clay strips is just a little too sharp, perhaps we want something that winds up being slightly softer around its extremities, we can increase the tip roundness here. But this is actually a value that I tend to tweak as I go, as I'm doing sculpting. Sometimes I actually want to have a very harsh, a very hard brush. Sometimes I actually want to have a very soft brush. So I have a tendency to play around with this particular value as I sculpt here. But if you want a brush stroke that is just a little bit softer, then just increase this particular tip roundness value that is right there. Once we have that nice buttery stroke, the next thing that we want to do is to adjust the strength of the brush and perhaps also the pressure curve on our tablet to make sure that we're getting very strong strokes when we're putting a good amount of pressure over our tablet and a very, very small amount of displacement of the surface when we are just gently running our cursor over the surface here. Now, I'm putting a minimal amount of pressure on the surface, and you can see that even then, I'm kind of getting something that isn't quite as shallow as I would want it to be. So I want to find the brush values and the pressure curve values that will really help me to have that very high range of displacement. So for the minimum pressure input, that's actually very easy because we can control the pressure curve to really get that where we want it to be. So let's tweak the maximum first. What I'm looking for is to put a lot of pressure over my tablet and just to judge if I'm getting a very, very nice amount of displacement on the surface. And this is actually pretty good. I have a feeling that maybe this is a little bit too much because the clay strips brush is an accumulation brush. As you can see, as we go back over the surface a few times, we are adding a lot of displacement to the surface. So I don't actually mind lowering this here a little bit, maybe put it at around 0.5. So you can see here as I do a few brush strokes here over the surface, we're getting a lot of displacement. And if I take a really, really big brush here and I just do little circles like these, I can actually displace the surface really, really, really far with only one brush stroke. I can create this sort of herniating massive polygons, as you can see here, that's just growing out of the sphere, which is actually very useful if I want to, let's say, add a neck to a head. So our maximum strength feels pretty good. And so the last thing that we want to do is to simply make sure that as we are going over the surface in a very soft way with our cursor, that we are only adding a minimal, a very, very small, very imperceptible amount of displacement to the surface. And it actually turns out that because I've brought the strength here down to 0.5, I'm actually getting kind of satisfied with this, but I'm going to be straight with you. Just playing with the strength value really wasn't enough for me to really get that very high range of displacement the way that I'm describing it. I actually had to tweak a few other settings. I had to actually go within edit, within the preferences. So in here, let's simply go to input. And in there, where it says tablet here, I've actually played around with this here because by default, this particular value was set to automatic and the softness here was set to 0. And just with those actual settings, I really wasn't able, you can see here how Like if I actually put just a very, very minimal amount of pressure over the surface, I'm still getting quite a lot of displacement there. So those default values here for the tablet really weren't working all that great for me. Depending on the tablet that you're using, maybe you may need to tweak these settings differently than mine. But what I have actually found was that I was getting a very nice range of displacement when I was setting the tablet API here from automatic to WinTab, and then also playing around with the softness value here. And I found that for me, a softness value of around minus 0.5 was actually giving me a very, very nice amount of range to the displacement of the surface there. In fact, we could even lower this even further and get even more of a range in here. You can see now with a value here of minus 0.75, if I gently brush over the surface, the strokes are almost imperceptible. So actually, that's not a bad value. So that's not actually a bad value. As I put a lot of pressure now, I'm getting a lot of displacement over the surface. And finally, if you're a Wacom user, you can also play around with the pressure curve within your Wacom settings, of course. So let's just launch here the Wacom tablet properties window. And in here, you can see that I've created a particular application preset for me for Blender. And in there, I can actually play with this tip feel value. If I find that I'm still not getting enough range, I can actually make the tip feel a little bit firmer. And the consequence of that will be the same as playing around with the softness value here within our Blender preferences. It's going to make it so that my very soft strokes will simply displace the surface even less. Once we tweak that, the best thing that we can do then is really just to have a go with these particular settings, see if we can get a very nice range of displacement over our surface. There you go, look at that. Smooth as butter, it looks beautiful. So what I like to do then is to simply build volume with those clay brushes. And once I have a volume that is roughly the way that I want it, then afterward I simply switch over to a polish brush, which in my case here is this fill/scrape brush. The thing that I've done here on the fill brush is that I have made sure that this particular checkbox here was turned on, first of all, invert to scrape, which makes it so that when we hold down control, we are actually flattening the surface, as you can see. Whereas when we're not holding control, we are filling in the little cavities over the surface. So we are effectively polishing the surface without having to rely on any type of smoothing. But by default, I find that the radius, especially of the scrape functionality here, I just find it a little bit small, okay? You can kind of see how big the cursor is right now on screen, and yet when I hold control to do a little bit of scraping here, you can see how narrow the stroke seems to be. So we can adjust that actually quite easily by simply playing around with the area radius here and increasing this particular value to somewhere around maybe around 0.8 or so. And then let's go to our scrape brush, which is the next one down here. And let's also make sure that our area radius is of the same value. And so if I go back here to my fill brush, now you can see that as I hold down control, I am actually scraping a bigger area of the brush. There's still something for me that isn't fully 100% there, and I have a bit of a hard time to put my finger on, but this is still really, really close, and I've successfully sculpted a few things in Blender already using these settings. But if I do tweak my settings on the fill brush in the future, and I think that it's relevant for me to mention that, I will go ahead and put that within a future YouTube video. So yeah, my mentality when it comes to sculpting, it's really just that. Add clay using the clay surface brush. And once you have added enough clay over the surface to represent the kind of volume that you're trying to sculpt, then simply switch over to a polish brush and then really just improve the quality of the surface until it looks exactly the way that you want it to be. And I have a tendency to always want to keep a little bit of imperfections over the surface. I don't like when a surface has been overly smoothed and it just looks like something that is just impossible in real life, especially when we talk about organic things. If we're talking about hard surface, of course, then that's a different story. But I really like on my organic sculpts to always keep a little bit of that imperfection, a little bit of those brush strokes that are visible there, as you can see, that are the result of using the clay brush. I like to keep a little bit of that because I find that it adds a lot of life to my sculptures. Even if I'm going to add, let's say, a bunch of skin pores on top of a head later on, and I want to make something that's going to be used within a portfolio setting, I still want to keep a little bit of that imperfection because I find that keeping a lot of that sketchiness over the surface starts to blend really well afterward with any type of tertiary details I could throw on top of there afterward. And it just makes the surface look more alive in the end. So that's why I don't have a tendency when I do sculpting to smooth the surface. I'll use a smooth brush here and there, just like everyone else. There are things that are just easier to do when you use the smooth brush, especially when you're sculpting things that are very curvy, like let's say a nose or ears. Just trying to reach the surface quality that we want without having to rely on a smooth brush is almost impossible. But in general, I try to avoid doing any type of smoothing, and I really stay away from the smooth brush as much as I can, because I just find that the smooth brush it destroys everything. Whereas if this isn't smooth enough for me somehow and I want to polish it further, using those polished brushes, make sure that I am reducing the intensity of some of the little artifacts that are over the surface, but everything that is there still stays relatively sharp. I'm preserving a lot more detail as I am polishing the surface than if I was to go over this with a big smooth brush. If I want to sculpt sharp details over the surface, maybe we're working over the nasolabial region and we want to have a somewhat sharp looking nasolabial fold, then of course we have here the Draw Sharp brush that actually does a really, really good job. The problem with the default settings over the Draw Sharp brush is that if I use a very big brush radius here, you can kind of tell as I zoom in here that just like for the clay strips brush, we're actually winding up seeing where all the individual samples have been put down on the surface because the distance between those samples is too high. So as we use the Draw Sharp brush to, let's say, sculpt some very sharp folds within skin, we want to make sure that we are tweaking those settings so that we get a very nice, buttery smooth stroke, just like for our clay strips brush. And there too, what we want to do is to simply play around with the space value here that you can see is also set to 5% here by default. So let's just lower that here. Let's try 2% here as well. And won't you look at that? I'm getting a much smoother stroke. If we feel that our stroke isn't sharp enough, we would just like to get a little bit more sharpness in there, then we can go down within the fall off tab that is right here. And we can switch from sharper over to custom and then simply tweak this default curve that is right here so that it looks like something that is very pointy, just like so. The last of the basic brushes that is very useful when it comes to sculpting that I like to use is the Move brush, of course. Now, Move brush, that's the name within ZBrush, but in this case here, it's called Grab. And that's just your standard Move brush. There's really nothing all that special to say about it by default. But what is interesting is that there too, we can play with the fall off here to go from its default value here of smooth over to sharper. And that will give us these very nice pointy displacement to the surface. I can take the surface and I can pull it in, and then I can create a bit of a dimple somewhere if I want to have a bit of a dimple on someone's face, let's say. So don't be afraid to experiment with this particular fall off here over your Move brush to see the kind of effect that it creates as you switch this over to something else than its default one. Because often the fall off over the Grab brush is really key to getting a movement as you grab the surface and you move it around to get the exact type of movement, the exact look that you are looking for. Now that our brushes are configured properly, let's go ahead and have a little bit of fun sculpting on this particular sphere. And I'll explain to you the kind of process that goes through my mind as I use these different brushes. Let's start by sculpting some lips together. One of the most important things that I want to mention, of course, is that when it comes to sculpting, the resolution that you use on your object really doesn't matter that much, okay? Because what is most important is that you worry about shaping volumes, shaping the surface in a way that will look really, really good. And the resolution at which you are sculpting doesn't matter that much. It's totally fine if we sculpt at a resolution where we can kind of see a little bit the polygons over the surface of our object. We can always increase the resolution of our object later and make sure that those details that were a little bit too low res become nice and sharp. Some people like to have this mentality of starting with a very, very low object to sculpt on top so that they really don't develop that kind of tunnel vision of overly focusing on details overly quickly at the start of a sculpt, and just to help them focus on the larger volumes in the beginning. I think that's totally cool. And if you're one of those that really struggles with that tunnel vision, you start to become way too detail focused way too early in the process, then keeping the resolution of your object relatively low is a really great way to make sure that you are not focusing on the wrong things right at the beginning. But I find that ultimately resolution is really just a question of preference, and you can sculpt on a mesh that is very dense at the beginning and wind up with a really, really good result. So ultimately, that question of resolution, at which resolution should you sculpt, is something that is, one, I think, up to our own personal preference. But as I've said, and I have alluded to before, just don't really beat yourself over that. Don't worry about it too much. It really doesn't matter. If your resolution is just a little bit too low, you can always increase it later on. So just don't worry about it too much. And you can even play with resolution levels and sculpt different heads at different resolutions and see how that kind of impact your own observation, your own judgment of the surface. I think that's totally cool. Personally speaking, I like to sculpt at a slightly higher resolution, even at the beginning, because I like to really feel some very nice and sharp brush strokes over the surface. I really like that kind of very rough feeling that we have when we do use a lot of those clay brushes and we don't do a lot of smoothing. I want to make sure that the surface kind of reflects that nice expressivity there. Of course, if you sculpt at a higher resolution, your smooth brush won't work as well, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. But I am not a big fan of using the smooth brush. And I encourage you to do the same. If you find that you overly rely on the smooth brush and you're just always smoothing your surface left and right because you really want to get rid of a lot of those little artifacts that are over the surface, then actually sculpting at a higher resolution may actually be beneficial for you, because then your smooth brush won't work as rely on the smooth sculpt at different resolutions. See how it works for you. See how you like that kind of very rough feeling that we have when we do use a lot of those clay brushes and we don't do a lot of smoothing. I want to make sure that the surface kind of reflects that nice expressivity there. Of course, if you sculpt at a higher resolution, your smooth brush won't work as well, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. But I am not a big fan of using the smooth brush. And I encourage you to do the same. If you find that you overly rely on the smooth brush and you're just always smoothing your surface left and right because you really want to get rid of a lot of those little artifacts that are over the surface, then actually sculpting at a higher resolution may actually be beneficial for you, because then your smooth brush won't work as well, which will in turn force you to seek other ways of polishing your surface. So don't be afraid to sculpt at different resolutions. See how it works for you. See how it feels for you. You might find that the resolution at which you like to sculpt, even in the beginning, is actually higher than perhaps other people will recommend. It's all a matter of exploration. It's all a matter of finding what works well for us. And in this case here, some of you have given me a great tip here, is to press Shift-R here to control the remesh grid. I'm going to bring the remesh value here fairly low so that my polygons are fairly high res. Somewhere about, I don't know, somewhere about here works. Right now, this object isn't even to scale, okay? If I'm actually working on the head, I probably want to scale this sphere to make sure that it is already of a proper head for a skull, but we're not going to do that in this particular case. I'll tell you more about that in a future video because things get a little bit complicated there. So for now, doesn't matter. We're just going to have a fun sketching session together here. We're going to set our polygons to be fairly small on our remesh, and I'm going to press Ctrl-R afterward to remesh this particular sphere. And we're going to wind up probably somewhere around 1 million polygons or so. Actually, just only 250,000, but that should be completely fine. Of course, always important, though, that we have very good performance when we sculpt. If performance starts to suffer, then we want to take a look either at our brush settings, or perhaps we're simply sculpting at a resolution that is too high here. But so what's my thought process, really? What goes through my mind as I do some sculpting in here? So this is really my process. You'll see it's actually very simple, okay? I use the clay strips brush and I just build the volumes that I think are somewhat representative of what I have in mind. And then afterward, I polish and I shape those volumes afterward using either more of the clay strips, but with a much lower intensity, or by using a polish brush, which in this case here is the fill brush. So the first thing we're going to do in here, we're just going to carve in there a somewhat deep opening here for the mouth. And of course, we want to make sure that this particular opening is somewhat the width that we want our lips to become. So we're kind of winding up with this cavity here that has these 90-degree angles to them. But of course, that doesn't work. We want to have diagonal planes in this particular case. So what we're going to do, we're essentially just going to fill up the top cavity here and the bottom cavity separately. We're going to fill up and we're going to make sure that this surface winds up being at a bit of an angle there. So that's where our fill brush really becomes really, really nice. Its goal is just to fill up cavities or to scrape away clay that we have added that is just a little bit too much. So I'm just going in here and I'm just filling this up, as you can see. And so as I'm doing that, I'm winding up with planes that are now at a diagonal angle. And I can hold down Control. I can polish this even further to get rid of some of those little imperfections that are there. I can continue to add here and perhaps even hold Control and try to shape this top lip here to have a little bit more of that M shape that we have typically on lips here. So I'm just carving in there and I'm just trying to carve in there a little bit of that M shape, as you can see. Just really try to shape the surface. We're always just trying to shape the surface so that it will wind up looking the way that we want it to look. Of course, at some point this does become bothersome, so let's just do a remesh to redistribute the polygons over our sphere. Here, we could probably smooth this out, that's fine. These are just artifacts from a low-res mesh, so we could definitely use a smooth brush here. I think that's okay, but it's not strictly necessary. And then we simply want to continue to shape this. So right now, the corners of our lips are obviously way too far apart, and I also want to add a little bit of meat here to the middle here of our top lip. So because we want to be adding, then we want to switch back over to our clay strips brush. And here, I'm just going to just very gently here, just brush over the surface. I usually don't overly restrict myself when it comes to brush direction. You'll see that I like to vary the brush direction. Sometimes I'll be doing these horizontal strokes. Sometimes I'll be going over the surface again with these vertical strokes. For me, it doesn't really matter that much as it matters that I am just very nicely, slowly building the kind of volumes that I think will be beneficial in this case here. So by adding a little bit of volume here to the side, I am bringing the top lip closer to the bottom lip. And all the while I'm doing that, I'm keeping a look on those volumes, and I'm looking at those volumes from different angles to make sure that those volumes, those angles wind up being what I want them to be. In this particular case, it would perhaps be beneficial to push the corner of the lips in a little bit. So again, with our clay strips brush here, I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to do circles in this particular case. As I said, it doesn't matter too much. I could have done horizontal strokes, could have done vertical strokes. But in this case, since I kind of want to push in here a somewhat circular hole over the corners of the lips here, it kind of makes sense for me to just make these kind of very sketchy kind of circles here with my brush. So I'm carving it here, and I'm even carving further than I probably should. But after I've carved in a little bit further in than I want to be, then afterward I can go back and I can add volume again within that little hole that I have created until I start to get the exact volume that I am looking for. So I'm just constantly adding, subtracting, until the volumes start to look the way that I want those volumes to look like. Our bottom lip, this particular section here, it's kind of sticking out a little bit further than I would want it to be. Usually the bottom lip, it looks like it's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit more narrow than the top lip. So again, here using my clay strips brush, I want to be carving in here and removing a lot of this mass that was just hanging off the sides here of our bottom lip. And with our bottom lip, we're really kind of trying to get what are just three main angles to them, or three main straight lines. Two here that are diagonal on the side there that are more or less kind of continuous with the natural border here for the top lip here. And then we want to have a somewhat straight segment in the middle there. Now, of course, everyone has a slightly different anatomy when it comes to lips, so you don't necessarily always want to be sculpting your lips exactly like that. You obviously want to be looking at your references and be judging how it looks there and what you should do yourself. But in general, that's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a bottom lip that has more or less three straight lines to its silhouette. And I can even go in here and I can start to sculpt a little bit of the volumes under that bottom lip if I want to, just to have something that looks a little bit more natural. At a lower intensity in this particular case, I'm just going to gently here pull the surface out, as you can see. I'm just going to do that very gently. I'm going to bring my brush here towards the bottom here. I'm going to do that there too. I'm trying to there too just really reinforce those kind of planes that are the continuation of the border of the lip here. So we've created 3 lines to our bottom lip, and now we want to create planes that extend down from there. So I'm really just using my clay strips brush and just trying to, with a very low brush intensity, just try to fill in there a little bit of that cavity that was there. That was a little bit too much. So as you can see, you can kind of go back and forth between the clay strips brush and then the fill brush to kind of do your filling in, if you will. Ultimately, the best thing you can do is really just keep on using those brushes, develop a bit of a sense for how they will affect the surface, and then you can just intuitively just choose whichever brush you think will be the most beneficial. My bottom lip is way too big compared to our top lip. Now, again, there are people like that, but I actually want to have a bottom lip that has a height that is closer to our top lip here. So once again, using my clay strips brush, I'm just going to go in here, I'm going to carve in there, and I'm going to remove some of that excess clay that is there so that I get a narrower bottom lip. So I could use a move brush for this too, but once again, I just like to use the clay strips brush in this particular case. It just feels right to me because I can just remove a little bit of that excess clay that was there very easily with it, and then just continue on from there. While we're there, why don't we sculpt a little bit of the philtrum? Once again, using the clay strips brush, you can see I could do little round strokes if I want. I can do lines, I can do crosshatch. It doesn't really matter to me what is the directionality that I'm putting in on the brush, as long as I am very nicely and slowly building up the volumes that I am looking for. Then for me, it's all good. But I do like to keep a somewhat consistent direction though. So it doesn't really matter to me if I'm doing brush strokes like these or like that. But I do like in general to keep a somewhat consistent, whatever is the original direction that I will be going over the surface with, I do like to keep a somewhat consistent direction and do a few brush strokes that have the same kind of directionality as that, because I just like the kind of effect that it gives to the surface. But it's not necessary to do that. And of course, you can work in other ways that will also give a very nice quality to the surface. The best thing you can do there, just experiment for yourself, play with the brushes, see how they feel for you, and perhaps through that you will develop your own personal style that you will afterward like, and that will look a little bit different than what everyone else is doing out there. The vermilion border of the top lip often is a little bit more raised, so we can kind of go ahead here, we can kind of do that here. Let's do a remesh once again, because we can see that we're starting to get a lot of stretching in different places. If your top lip and your bottom lip start to fuse a little bit like that, don't worry about it, all right? We can fix this later on. Once we got our sketch of our head down and it looks great, then later on we can worry about little details like that, like some of those little artifacts that you may wind up in crevices like these. Even the fact that the top lip and the bottom lip here is getting merged together. In this particular case, I really just don't really care about that, to be honest. So with our fill brush here, I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to fill this in here a little bit to get more of a planar look to our top lip. And I'm going to hold control and I'm going to subtract here to remove a little bit of that excess clay that is hanging on to the sides of the top lip that are right there. Now this is starting to look a little too 90 degrees for me. So once again, using our fill brush here, I'm just going to hold down control and we're going to shape this so that it just looks better for us. Now you can see what's kind of happening as I get closer to the lower lip there. So that's a pretty legitimate place to use a little bit of smoothing. Let's switch back over to our fill brush. Let's see what kind of more polish we can do over this here. Maybe get rid of some of those artifacts that are on the side there. Let me swap back over here to my clay strips here. And I'm just going to subtract a little bit more of that clay that is right here. In fact, the whole top lip, it's kind of a little bit too shallow if we look at this from this particular angle. I would actually like the sides here of the lips, the corners of the lips, to actually be further inward than what we currently have. The whole lips are just a little bit too shallow for me. So I could actually sculpt that. I could use my clay brush and I could just go in here and I could push the corners of the lips in here a little bit more. But truth be told, this is actually a pretty good place to use our grab brush. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's switch over to the grab brush. And in fact, if I just use the grab brush with the default fall off, I'm not really going to get a kind of movement that I kind of like. In fact, actually, it doesn't really look that bad now that I think about it. But often this doesn't quite give me the fall off that I'm looking for. Sometimes I actually prefer to switch over here to our sharper fall off on our grab brush. And then you can see the kind of effect that it's going to give me. As I pull in the corners here of the lips, you can see that the fall off definitely has a very appreciable impact on the shape that our surface winds up having. We can continue to sculpt on this. Here I'm going to switch back over to our clay strips brush. This corner here doesn't quite look the way that I would actually want it to be. Let me just get rid of a little bit of that mask that is right there. And we can extend, we can continue the vermilion border of the lower lip towards the corner of the top lip. Just going to add a little bit of matter right here. I'm going to create a bit of a line, as you can see. And that will allow us to connect a little bit better the lower lip to the top lip. The top lip here, we do want there to be a convergence between the top lip and the bottom lip. So this is kind of a little bit too high. It's not quite going where it needs to be. All right, let's just use our clay strips brush once again. And let's just subtract a lot of this matter that is right here. So we're constantly just shaping the surface, trying to get the volumes that we want. We're working in a way that is very rough because we don't want to develop a tunnel vision. Very, very important, okay? We want to be very nimble. We want to be moving around the surface. We want to be defining everything at once. Let me swap back over to our grab brush and let me simply pull this down here a little bit. In fact, let me switch our fall off back to the default smooth fall off. And let me just do a little bit more shaping for our top lip. Maybe we want to be pulling out the middle of the top lip out a little bit more, just like that. And then maybe as a last touch here, I can pull out where the philtrum here would actually merge with the nose that is right here. You add a little bit of mass, you subtract a little bit of mass, then you switch over to your fill brush and you simply polish the surface. There are too many artifacts here. Let's just get rid of those. Let's just flatten those out here. We can flatten the top here a little bit more. We can hunt for places where the volumes are not exactly what we want them to be, and then we can just go to town and continue to sculpt those and shape those until they are exactly what we want them to be. So, not that complicated, right? It's actually even quite fun, and it's quite liberating to be working in such a loose way. And then, if I'm kind of bothered by the fact that I can kind of see within the mouth here a little bit, well, I can actually finish this off by using a little bit of pinch brush. And let's just go to town in there and really just pinch in between those lips. Once this is pinched together, let's do a remesh. And I could continue on from there. I could take my grab brush again, continue to shape this exactly the way that I want it to be. And we could continue on from there and sculpt the rest of the head. So it's really not all that complicated, right? There's really just a few basic brushes, but it's really about just getting a good feeling for how those different brushes will really impact the surface, will really kind of help you shape the surface. And the best thing you can do is just explore, use different brushes, see how they feel, develop a bit of a feeling yourself for how they work. You can even, and definitely should, you can obviously explore other brushes than the one that I'm showing you right now and see how those actually impact the surface that you are sculpting. And through there, you may even discover your own signature style of sculpting. So do a lot of exploration. A lot of knowledge really comes from simply taking the time to just explore, have some fun, be very playful with the tools that you have. Those are great ways to deepen your knowledge of how to sculpt. And once we have sculpted our likeness, then we can start to worry about the technical side of things. Performance. I'm not gonna lie, Blender handled itself pretty well when I was doing sculpting at pretty high resolutions. This is my Emily Blunt portrait, and you can see here that I have about 2,400,000 points, and the sculpting feels very nice, very, very quick. I was really scared hearing other people at first that were describing sculpting in Blender as something that was very, very laborious in terms of performance. And maybe that was true in the past, and now it's a little bit less true. I'm running Blender version 3.2, and perhaps they have done some improvements there. But my experience so far has been very, very positive as far as performance is concerned. I can even use a really, really big brush here, and you can see that my performance is really, really nice when it comes to sculpting. So 2,400,000 points, no problem. Blender handles that like a champ. Now, of course, there's always a question of, well, what kind of computer do you have, and is that a factor or not? Well, my computer really isn't all that great, okay? I do have a very fancy 3090 video card, but outside of that, my computer is actually a few years old. And let me just bring here the task manager so that you can actually take a look at the performance graphs as we do a little bit of sculpting together there. My memory here, I'm only using 11 gigs right now out of the 64 that I have installed on this particular computer. And that's considering that I'm also recording this particular video at the same time. So I have other things running right now that are eating within that 11 gigs that is in use right now. But so even at 2,400,000 points, we're really not using all that much memory if you really think about it. And my CPU, it's 4 years old at this point. I'm running an Intel 9900K. It was a really good CPU when it came out, but it is 4 years old at this point. So any type of modern, affordable CPU should net you some very similar performance results as this here. So yeah, I do run a 3090 right now as far as the video card is concerned, but most of what you're actually seeing here is because of the video encoding that I'm recording at the same time. It's not actually coming from Blender. So you can see that on this particular computer, we have a lot of resources that are still available. So let's try and see how far can we push that then? How far can we push performance into Blender? And when do we get into territory where performance really starts to become a problem within Blender? One thing I do want to mention straight away though is that there can be a very big performance hit when using the multi-res modifier. Believe it or not, you think about multi-res modifier as something that should allow you to, quote unquote, win some performance here and there, as opposed to be sculpting on a mesh where all of the polygons are always active all of the time, as it is in this particular case, since this mesh has only been remeshed so far. But I've actually found that depending on the settings of the multi-res, I could actually get worse performance in there than if I was sculpting on a mesh that wasn't using multi-res in any way and was just using a very, very dense remesh. So that's kind of interesting because if you're within ZBrush, subdividing your mesh is the best way to be able to sculpt at a very high resolution for a very low performance cost. But within Blender, for me, that's not as quite clear cut. And I'll show you why afterward. But first, let's see how far we can actually push this mesh without the multi-res modifier. And let's see how high we can go before performance actually becomes a problem here. Let me go ahead here and play with the remesh resolution. So right now we are at 0.03 centimeters, as you can see. Let me lower that here. Let's go to 0.01. And let's see how performance holds up. Through the magic of video editing, this remesh finished instantly, but I'm not gonna lie, this actually took at least a solid minute to calculate. And look at that, our memory has jumped up from 11 gigs over to 28 gigs. And our CPU, well, kind of had a bit of a workout there, but it's back at being quite low. And we are up to 21 million vertices, almost 22 million vertices in this particular case. Let's see how it looks like now. Yeah, see, this is actually, it's not too bad. I probably don't necessarily want to be sculpting at this resolution all of the time. But considering the fact that we're at 21 million triangles, this is really not all that bad. In fact, on different places, this even feels really, really good. I wouldn't want to be sculpting the whole head from scratch in this particular resolution. But this is holding itself up pretty well, right? So we're at 21 million points right now. Let's say that we reduce that over to maybe 10 million. This would probably feel very, very instantaneous, all these different brushstrokes. And depending where I am sculpting, this actually feels very instantaneous, in fact. So 21 million, well, that's pretty high for just general sculpting of the general shapes. But one thing I've discovered about Blender is that the performance is directly tied to the amount of polygons that you're sculpting over. Now that obviously makes intuitive sense. But the moment that you're kind of zoomed in here a little bit, once you start to sculpt there, you can see that performance now is actually very, very, very nice. So if we're sculpting the major shapes of something at 21 million polygons, yeah, we're probably asking for trouble, and it kind of makes sense that Blender would start to slow down and performance would actually be kind of terrible. But if we increase the resolution to this degree, once we start to really get down within the little details of something, then you can see that performance within Blender is still very, very nice. And it's more than acceptable if we're trying to simply sculpt details on top of something. And in terms of memory, we're not even at 32 gigs yet. So conceivably, someone who even has 32 gigs installed, as far as their RAM is concerned, and not 64 like I have, could probably still be working at such a high resolution. And I think a lot of people probably have 32 gigs within their machines or within their laptops. So you could conceivably go really, really high on a single subdivision, even with a computer that only has, let's say, 32 gigs. And you can see the CPU there. It's getting a bit of a workout, but considering the fact that the CPU is 4 years old, I have to imagine that a more recent CPU, more recent computer, would really just have a field day sculpting at this particular resolution. So we could conceivably push this even higher than this. Our GPU has also shot up a little bit, but not that much. But then again, yes, it's a 3090, so maybe that's a little bit cheating as far as performance tests are concerned. So can we go even higher than that? That's a great question, right? What happens if I push this even further? So let's have this. So let's say 0.005. And in fact, it's not even taking a value here. I can't even bring this further down than 0.01. So in a way, we have reached the limit here of Blender. But that's totally fine. There really aren't a lot of circumstances when you would be wanting to sculpt on a head without using any type of subdivision or multi-res and be at anything perhaps even close to 21 million. Because of course, when you sculpt the head, you start with a sketch and you really don't need that many polygons to be able to define a sketch. And then eventually you want to switch over to something like multi-res when it comes time to really start to worry about the fine details there. Okay, but I'm still kind of interested to see if we can push this a little bit further here. So even though I can't actually bring this remesh value further down than 0.01, what I could actually do is to throw a multi-res modifier on top of this so that we can get even more polygons going. Now, this isn't in any way a proper workflow, okay? I'm just doing this for science. So let's go ahead here and throw in a multi-res modifier on top of this. Ooh, that's not good. That's not good. Yeah, so 21 million then. That sounds like a pretty good limit. That's actually enough to sculpt whatever it is that we would want to sculpt without using subdivisions. But I'm not really satisfied. I think we can still push this higher than 21 million without a problem within Blender. So let's do that again. And this is where we need to start to use the multi-res modifier for sure. Now, as I've alluded to before, performance using multi-res isn't necessarily better than performance without using multi-res, depending on the settings that we have for the multi-res. I know that sounds kind of weird and counterintuitive. You would actually think that no, performance should be better, especially if you're coming from ZBrush, where you know that subdivision levels in there definitely help performance. But without Blender, that's not necessarily a done deal. And I'll show you why. So this is a cube, of course. This is a very pretty cube, and we're going to subdivide this. Now, one thing I got tired of very quickly within Blender was to have to go and add a multi-res modifier manually before I could actually subdivide something to be able to sculpt on it. If you use ZBrush, you know that you simply have to press Ctrl-D to subdivide something in there, and you don't actually have to somehow add a modifier to your object before you can actually subdivide it a few times. So I actually got very tired very quickly within Blender of having to manually add a multi-res modifier every time that I wanted to subdivide something. I just wanted to be able to open Blender and then press Ctrl-D and subdivide something straight away. So I've done what any self-respecting 3D artist with way too much time on their hand does, like me in this particular case. And I wrote my first plugin in Blender using Python. That sounded like a pragmatic solution, right? So I wrote a little plugin that once we are in sculpt mode, adds a little entry to the sculpt menu that is right there that is called multi-res add subdivide. It's a very simple plugin. Its function is really only to add that one function to the sculpt menu. And you can see that I've applied the shortcut here, Ctrl-D, so that it is the same as what I have within ZBrush. And what this very simple plugin does is that it will add a multi-res modifier and subdivide it if there is no multi-res modifier on an object to begin with. And if there already is a multi-res modifier that is there, it will simply subdivide it further. So you can start from an object like this one here, like this particular cube. You can see there's